All right, time to get cracking on part 2 of our discussion for Florida history for the week that I'm gone. I wish I had something happy to talk about here, but nothing happy this week. We're going to be talking about particularly the issue of race and racism in Florida in the 1920s. This was a huge problem nationally in the United States. It was a huge problem regionally in the American South, and it's going to be a problem for Florida. So we're going to talk about the history of this really, in a lot of ways, kind of the most racist decade, maybe, in Florida history, and we're going to deal with what are the causes of this, what is the situation, the divide between black Floridians and white Floridians in the 1920s. We're going to talk about lynching, and we're also going to go through then a few examples of racial pogroms where black communities are attacked. And we'll talk about, what were the causes of those and what happened with this one. And so just also fair warning, there are going to be some kind of disturbing images here, particularly when we talk about lynching in Florida. All right. Now, during World War I, and then also immediately after World War I, the number of African Americans in Florida, at least by percentage, is going to drop. About 40,000 or more African Americans are going to leave. This was part of a larger trend in the American South where African Americans are going to go away to the northern cities for a couple of reasons. One, you have the Jim Crow South, where civil rights were largely denied, and there was a lot of oppression and violence. And then also, these industrial jobs that were opening up in northern cities were generally better paying than a lot of the agricultural labor that they could find in Florida. So this is going to drop the percentage of African Americans in Florida to about 30%, down from somewhere around 40% that they had been before. Also, too, what we're seeing is the massive immigration into Florida that had taken place in the 1920s is going to be mostly white. Right, so that's going to alter the racial makeup of the state as well. Now, if you didn't leave, and if you were a black Floridian staying here, generally speaking, you still had the relatively similar agrarian lives in the rural interior that your ancestors for several generations had probably lived. Right. This also meant, though, that while there's a lot of media attention on Florida in the 1920s, there's not a lot of media attention on the rural sort of interior, and so a lot of what's going to go on with Jim Crow, a lot of what's going to go on with racial violence is not going to get really noticed by a lot of people outside the state. Now, in the areas where segregation was the rule, segregation was hardcore. It was pretty harsh. It was often either violent or it had strong sort of violent overtones that was going along with it. It was actually pretty normal at this point in Florida history not to be living in a segregated section of a white town or sort of a shared town. It was actually pretty normal in a lot of these more rural areas to have a completely segregated African American town and then a white town. Now, there may only have been 2 or 3 miles of difference between them, but that was what you usually saw. Now, oftentimes what would happen, and we'll see this in the example of Rosewood, is that there was a shared sort of economic engine in the area that both white and black laborers would show up to. So that was something that was sometimes held in common, not always. We're going to see that also the 1920s is a great decade if you're a Klansman, right? The Ku Klux Klan and some other white supremacy, sort of vigilance societies could kind of do what they wanted in the rural interior. In many cases, they were ignored by local law enforcement, and kind of worst case scenario, they were often aided by local law enforcement. So this is the Klan. They're doing Klan stuff, right? I don't know that it's really bright to go out in the dry sort of pine needle woods of Florida and set things on fire while you're wearing white cotton robes, but hey, this is what they do, right? The Burning Cross, which has never made a lot of sense to me, but anyway, this is how you scare people. Dress up like a ghost, set stuff on fire. This was a letter that was written late teens, early 20s to an NAACP member, and this is from the Grand Master of Florida Ku Klux, right? And if you can't quite read it, right? If you are familiar with the history of the days of Reconstruction, which followed in the wake of the Civil War, you will recall that the Scalawags of the North and the Republicans of the South proceeded very much the same as you are proceeding to instill into the Negro the idea of social equality. You will also remember that these things forced the loyal citizens of the South to organize clans of determined men who pledged themselves to maintain white supremacy and to safeguard our women and children. Now, if you are a scholar, you know that history repeats itself, and that he who resorts to your kind of game is handling edged tools. We shall always enjoy, and this is in capital letters, white supremacy. in this country, and he who interferes must face the consequences. So there you go, pretty thinly veiled threat from these Klan type people, right? So if you were black and in the interior, you really couldn't expect a lot of notice or help from outside of the state. So a lot of these national sort of movements to try to address some of these issues probably are not going to reach you in rural Florida, right? Like I said, kind of best case scenario is being ignored by state authorities, and at the worst case, kind of being openly targeted by them, right? Sidney J. Katz, who we talked about earlier in class, running for governor, was Florida governor from 1917 through 1921, and this was a letter that he wrote in response to African Americans writing about, civil rights and police brutality and things like that. And this was his actual quote back to them. So this is the governor of Florida. Your race is always harping on the disgrace it brings to the state by a concourse of white people taking revenge for the dishonoring of white women, when if you would teach your people not to kill our white officers and disgrace our white women, you would keep down 1,000 times greater disgrace. So basically, they complained, hey, you guys beat the crap out of us either in uniform or out of uniform, and we don't like it. And Sidney J. Katz said, well, hey, if you guys behaved yourself, you wouldn't get, beaten up. That's where things were in circa 1920 Florida, right? So Florida was a national leader in a lot of categories in the 1920s, right? Cigar manufacture, beach tourism, and lynching, yeah. Florida's overall population was still a lot smaller than most of the other southern states, while its growth rate was prodigious. And thus it has a much smaller African American population. And so if you look at the overall numbers of just total number of lynchings in Florida, it's going to be a lot smaller. But when you start looking at the percentages, right, the lynching rate, how many lynchings could you expect out of every 10,000 citizens, for example? Florida had the highest lynching rate in the nation at 4.5 lynchings, right, 4.5 per 10,000 African American residents. And so you start throwing numbers around, and sometimes it's easy to get lost in what do big numbers, what does that actually mean, right? Well, let's put it into comparison, right? Where does Florida stack up against some of these other states that you would expect to be like way more lynchy than Florida, right? Well, Florida's lynching rate was twice as high as Mississippi's, Georgia's, and Louisiana. It was 3 times higher than Alabama's lynching rate. It was 6 times higher than the rate of South Carolina. Yeah, in Florida, you were 6 times more likely to get lynched than in South Carolina. Right? So, aiding all this is Florida had a really high proportion of Klan membership. Now, the Klan also in the 1920s really has its best decade ever. I know that most of us sort of think of the Klan as this immediate post-Civil War kind of thing. But nationally, the Klan became really, really popular in the 1920s, partly because they expanded the hate. They went beyond just, well, we hate black people. It was also, we hate Jews, we hate Catholics, we hate immigrant groups, we hate communists. So really, they could kind of hit on all cylinders there. But this is not going to aid life in Florida in the 1920s. And so lynchings were bad, right? This is what you would see sometimes, is these guys were lynched publicly. Now, we got a couple of examples, right, of some of these they were often referred to as race riots, but they're really racial pogroms, which is one sort of race group gets their whole community gets attacked by another one. And the one that's the more famous of the two that you've probably heard of was Rosewood, right? Now, for those of you that have no idea, what I'm talking about here, Rosewood was an all African American segregated town. It was in the southern Big Bend region near Cedar Key. It's in Levy County, right? And it was about 2 miles away or so from a white town in the region, and there was a lumber mill in the area that both the white and the black men sort of both worked at, right? Well, we're going to have an incident that happens in 1923 to spark all of this coming into an explosion. And what happens is Fannie Taylor was a local white woman. This is also a fun fact. This is when you could name your daughter Fannie and not have people laugh at you, right? And so anyway, but she reported an attack upon her, right, which was a rape, and you'll notice I put rape in quotes, right, rape attempt by an unidentified black man. Well, as Ms. Taylor told this story again and again to people, it got sort of bigger and more out of control. What may have started out as a simple, the guy was rude to her or something like that, became an attack, and then the attack became him knocking her down, and then him knocking her down became a rape attempt, right? And so the problem with this, when we go back to sources is, how do we know what we know? And Fannie Taylor's story kept changing. with this. And she didn't recognize the man. But, of course, as this story spread amongst the white male citizenry of the area, well, they, of course, knew who it was. And a lot of people think that this is probably, they already had problems with some of the black men because of friction at work. And that they didn't really need a lot of hardcore details to act out their revenge on these people that they had targeted. And so, but once the news of, white ladies raped by a black guy, once that spreads into the community, it takes off like a virus. And this vigilante group of whites, they sort of form. They're going to attack Rosewood actually on 2 occasions. First one is they're going to go to this guy's cabin looking for him. He's not there. They kind of rough up the family. But then when they get back, an even bigger lynch mob has formed. And, well, you can't form a lynch mob and not go after people. So they go back to Rosewood the second time, and at this time they attack the guy's cabin. He's still not there. Kill some people, burn the cabin down, and then eventually they just attack and burn the whole town down. Most of the population, in fact, escapes into the local swamps, and they would hide out amongst other black communities in the area. But at least 9 are murdered, and we say at least 9 because those are the bodies that are found. All this was discovered much, much later. It wasn't discovered until the 1980s when a reporter who was actually looking for something else was going through some of the state archives, and they were looking at these communications between the state government and the Levy County authorities. They're saying, hey, we heard you guys are having like a race riot down there in Levy County. Do you guys need help? Do we need to send like state officers in? And of course the Levy County sheriff's office was like, nah, we got it. It's just there was a black guy, and he supposedly raped this white lady, and so they're just taking care of it. They're going to burn the town down. And so, okay. And so the guy then had to go and visit a lot of these now very elderly African Americans to ask about, hey, what happened? And they naturally kept their mouths shut because you never know when this race riot people, they're going to come back and get you. So this was the story of Rosewood and kind of how it ended. You can see on the map here where Rosewood was. It's fairly close to Cedar Key in Levy County. This was the lumber mill near Rosewood where both the white and the black workers apparently worked together and maybe was the source of all the friction. And then this is one of the cabins being burnt to the ground. Got a little victory party, right? Right there at the end, right? White guys storm the town. They leave one of the buildings standing. They got their little victory plaque there. I've never been able to read what they wrote on chalk. It looks like 1461. That I don't know that's the date, or that's probably not how many people live there either. But they look pretty pleased with themselves. They've got shotguns and pistols, and they even brought a little kid, right? Because, what good is it if you're going to pour out your hatred on another racial group and you don't have the chance to turn it into an educational opportunity? So this, in the 1990s, got turned into a film, right? Rosewood had John Voight and Ving Rhames in it. A little bit more action in the movie than there was in the actual event. But, hey, Rosewood is a bunch of crazy backwoods people, living in the pine trees of Levy County, right? That's nutty, backwoods hillbilly kind of behavior. Not necessarily, right? Because we're going to have the counterpoint example, and that's Ocoee, because Ocoee was actually happening in a big city, right? This Ocoee was not a completely segregated town. It was a segregated part, right? It was a segregated sort of suburb of Orlando, right? Now, Orlando then in 1920 was not the Orlando of today. But still, Orlando was a big enough city to where these shouldn't be, backcountry, crazy people. But we're going to have a massive racial pogrom that takes place there in 1920. Now, the tensions that had been building there were based on the fact that some African Americans had some financial success, and they were owning some sizable chunks of real estate. They were possibly crowding out white investors in the area. They were starting to employ larger numbers of African Americans in the workforce, and this was causing a significant amount of socioeconomic friction between them and white people who, in some cases, didn't have as much money as some of these guys. And the issue that finally caused the dam to burst was a number of local African Americans attempted to vote, which while technically legal, was very much against the Jim Crow system, and that's going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back in this regard. And this is going to trigger a white mob storming the town, which in this case meant crossing the street into Ocoee, and they're going to burn a number of these buildings, a number of these businesses. They're going to kill, again, we have to use this number at least, right? At least 4. Most of the town people are forced to flee. Right. This is Julie Perry. He was one of these big time landowners in the area, and he is one of the 4 that for sure is killed. It was assumed that he was one of kind of the leading figures in Ocoee to try to say, hey, we should exercise our right to vote. We have a vested interest in what goes on in Orlando, and he's going to be one of the at least 4 that's going to take place. Also, when we talk about race relations in Florida in the 1920s, we have to consider what's the socioeconomic status that's forcing a lot of people to be unable to do anything about the Jim Crow system, and that is due to the changing nature of particularly agricultural labor. Right? We did talk last time about how there was the convict leasing system, right, that had ended in 1919. And so we're also going to see that that same year, if you were a free, non-prisoner, type of labor, but if you were working at one of these turpentine camps way out in the middle of nowhere, they could hold you if you wound up owing more to them than you had worked off, which to us today that doesn't make any sense. How could you owe your employer money still? Well, at these turpentine camps, they paid you money, but then they also rented you a place to stay. They also sold you your food, and if there was anything else that you wanted to buy, you could buy it from the company store on credit for however much your wages were going to be. Well, a lot of these turpentine operators would do the math on this, and they would say, hey, you actually owed more than you earned this year, and because of the nature of where you were, they could essentially force you to stay there, okay? Now, in some cases, a lot of these turpentine operators, they made sure that you owed them more than you had worked off. And this created a situation that was very similar to kind of slavery, where they could force you to stay and work because overwhelmingly the workforce was black, overwhelmingly the management was white, and this was something that looked eerily familiar. This practice of debt peonage would finally be brought to a close, but not until 1949. Yeah, it would take until after World War II for these guys to fix this system. And so that's our rather uncomfortable discussion on Florida and race in the 1920s.